Well, afternoon everyone and welcome. I'm Ron Glanville and I'm pleased to welcome you all to this afternoon's presentation from Dr. Robert Glasser. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land where each of us is located today. I also pay my respects to elders past, present and future. Today we're honoured to have Robert Glasser present to us. Robert has an impressive record in the area of global climate action. Until recently, he was a special representative of the Secretary General for Disaster Risk Reduction, Assistant Secretary General and Head of the United Nations Office of Disaster Risk Reduction. Amongst other things, before joining the UN, Robert was the Secretary General of CARE International, one of the world's largest non-governmental humanitarian organisations. He was also previously a board member of the Global Call for Climate Action, a global alliance of more than 450 national and international organisations focusing on climate change advocacy. Robert, your talk has created a lot of interest within the veterinary profession. So joining us today, we have Jeanette Kessels, Board Chair of Veterinarians for Climate Action, as well as its CEO, Ben Cox, and some other members. Also attending, hopefully, is Dr. Mark Shipp, our current Australian Chief Veterinary Officer and President of the World Animal Health Organisation. We've got a number of other current and former Chief Veterinary Officers. We've got Warwick Vale, our AVA President, and Julia Crawford, our AVA Past President, as well as some other board members. We also have Paul Blanc, National Sales Director at ProVet, and Brian Oakley, CEO of Lipard Australia. So thanks everyone for attending. As a group, we understand that climate change is a serious threat, not only to people, but also to our animals. 2 weeks ago, we learned a lot more about this from Mark Howden. Today, we look forward to extending our education from you. Robert will talk for about 30 minutes, and we will then have 30 minutes for questions and discussion. The session will be recorded, so please remain on mute for the first half an hour, then we'll open up the field for questions. Please also feel free to put questions in the chat window as we go along. Thanks again for taking the time for us today, Robert, and over to you.
Okay, first of all, I want to thank each of you. It's quite a distinguished audience, so I really appreciate you taking the time to join me, and I'll be happy to share some bits of information with you and then discuss them with you as well. I'm just wondering if I can ask to share the screen so I can put up a few slides. I'm not quite sure who the host is.
That would be me. Give me 1 second and I'll... How do you do that? Is it not available down the bottom, Robert?
I think it's, do you have a security box at the bottom? Otherwise I can talk without slides, but it might be... and it says grant access to it's probably the bottom right hand corner. I think it says security.
No, I haven't got that.
Okay. Okay, well, I don't need the slides. I can speak without them.
Here we go. I think I fixed it.
Okay.
Have a look at that now.
Yeah, got it. Thank you.
Cool. Sorry about that.
No worries. No worries. That's great. Thank you. And I will, let's see. Okay, I hope you can see those slides now. Yep. Okay. So again, thank you very much. I'll speak for about 30 minutes and then look forward to the discussion afterwards. What I want to do, I know Mark, you had a chat with Mark a short time ago. He is wonderful and one of the global authorities on climate science and climate issues. But I do want to highlight a few things. Mark sent me an email and described what he spoke with you about, but I do just want to touch on a few of the findings that I don't think he mentioned because they're relevant to what I say later. And then I want to highlight something that is a greatly underappreciated risk with climate, and that is the prospect of simultaneous events that have cascading impacts on society. And then I want to focus on the solutions, on how we build a more resilient Australia, and also end, in spite of the fact that there are plenty of reasons to be pessimistic, with some reasons for optimism. And I think there are some that are really encouraging. So first, I don't know if any of you have been to Wudjil in far north Queensland, but I'm on the board of the Queensland Reconstruction Authority, and QRA is responsible for rebuilding in local communities after disasters. And they also coordinate Queensland's resilience, climate and disaster resilience strategy across government. And the board periodically goes out to see some of the reconstruction efforts. And last November, we went to Wujal, which is an Aboriginal community, absolutely stunningly beautiful place. And when we arrived, we were greeted by Uncle Billy, who took us up to the waterfall, their sacred site, and welcomed us with a smoke ceremony. But anyway, we were visiting Wujal because it had been absolutely devastated in the massive floodings that happened earlier that year, 2019. There was a monsoonal trough that settled over northern Queensland, and Wujal was absolutely devastated with flooding. The floods inundated virtually the whole town and cut off parts of the town where elderly Aboriginal elders were living from the rest of the town. So the younger men had to go wade across and often swim across the water and carry the elderly people back to higher land. The local crocodile that everyone knows and is enormous had free reign across throughout the area while they were ferrying their elderly back to safety. And one of the other elders, not Uncle Billy, mentioned to me that in the midst of this crisis, Uncle Billy went up to the waterfall, the sacred site, and was throwing debris back into the water and yelling at his Aboriginal warrior ancestors, basically saying, "Enough, why haven't you warned us about this?" And the point was that in tens of thousands of years of songlines and stories, there was nothing that prepared them for the scale of this flood because it was unprecedented for them. And that is, for me, that was a very vivid, that image of him on the rocks. You know, he's got a big gray beard, yelling and throwing debris back into the river. It's just stuck with me from this trip as kind of indicative of the scale of the challenge that we've got with climate change. The three things I want to say about climate change are these. First, that even relatively small changes in temperature have big impacts on hazards, which in turn then have big impacts on communities like Wujal. Secondly, that we are going to be surprised by what happens in the years ahead because the changes are now happening non-linearly, not linearly. So what we've seen over the past 10 years doesn't prepare us for what we will see over the next 10 years. And the third point is that we've already locked into 1.5 degrees of warming. I'm sure Mark mentioned that even if all greenhouse gases stopped tomorrow morning, the planet would continue to warm. So I just want to touch on those 3 points because they put into context some of the other things I'm going to say. First, small changes have big impacts. Extreme heat events have increased something like 20-fold over the last 10 years relative to the previous 30 years. If you see this chart, I hope you can see this clearly. That thin line is a normal distribution of climate, basically, of temperature anomalies. So it has a tail on the left, which is extremely cold days, and a tail on the right is extremely hot days, and there are an equal number of extreme hot and extreme cold. Well, climate change has shifted that chart, that distribution to the right. And if you see now, the areas of temperature anomalies are just huge relative to before that shift. And that reflects less than 1 degree of warming. So even a small temperature increase results in a huge increase in extreme temperatures. And just to put this into context, we're on track for 3 degrees of warming. So even with 1 degree, we're already seeing an explosion in extreme temperatures. But that shift is continuing to the right. And as you can see, the more it shifts, it's a non-linear change in the extreme temperatures. Another example of small changes equal big impacts is sea level rise and extreme flooding. Because with 10 centimeters of sea level rise, a 1 in 100 year flooding event becomes a 1 in 33 year flooding event. When that doubles, it becomes a 1 in 11 year event. And very soon, we should expect the historically extreme 1 in 100 year event to be an annual event in many places around the world. The IPCC, the mid-range estimate is that we're on track for a 30 centimeter rise by 2050. So another very important illustration of this, the fact that small changes can have very big impacts, is an IPCC. I'm sure Mark mentioned the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They produced a report, I guess it was a little over a year and a bit ago, which was essentially the member states of the United Nations asked the IPCC to explain, what is the big difference? What's the difference between 1.5 degrees of warming and 2 degrees of warming? Because the Paris Climate Agreement says the objective is to keep warming to 1.5 degrees, but no more than 2 degrees. So the countries around the world wanted to know what that difference means. And that 0.5 degree difference means a 50% increase in water stress for countries around the world, 420 million more people exposed to extreme heat waves, up to 270 million more people exposed to water scarcity, a 10-fold increase in vulnerable people exposed to decreases in crop yields. And that figure jumps to a 30% increase when you go from 2 degrees to 3 degrees of warming. And then when you combine these effects, it's something like 100 million people, additional people falling into poverty. So now, of course, these numbers are full of uncertainty. These are the range, there's actually ranges. I've picked the midpoint for each of these ranges. But this is the best guess of the science community about some global impacts from that 0.5 degree difference. So a small temperature increase, huge impacts on humans and society around the world. Now, as horrible as those last figures are that I've described, they are actually huge understatements of the impacts. And that's because almost all of the science, this is changing now, finally, but virtually all of the science on the impacts of climate change treat hazards as if they're independent variables, rather than that there are changes happening, that there's a global systemic change happening, and that many hazards are increasing at the same time. So for example, the science might look at what impact does increasing temperatures have on agricultural production, but not on the impacts of the change in patterns of pests, flooding, extreme weather events, and the immigration and displacement of populations, and all these other things that are happening at the same time, because climate change is a systemic change. It's not, it affects multiple variables, and it's technically extremely difficult, and this is why there hasn't been a lot of work on this, to study. It's hard enough to look at one variable and as an independent variable, but when you bring in these other factors, it becomes extremely difficult. And climate change is increasing the risk of these compound hazards that either strike at the same time or consecutively, or with the period of time separating them decreasing, for three main reasons. One is because climate change is increasing the severity and the frequency of hazards, sudden onset hazards like cyclone, not the frequency of cyclones, but the severity of cyclones, but certainly bushfires and flooding. Secondly, because it's changing the patterns these hazards are taking. So the lengthening bushfire season, the fact that there's a lot of evidence that suggests in Australia, for example, that cyclones are already beginning to track further south into areas of Australia like the Gold Coast, where structures have not been built to withstand extreme winds that are associated with cyclones. And so the patterns are changing, and that creates opportunities for these cascading impacts. And also because these sudden onset hazards are interacting with slow onset hazards like droughts and sea level rise. Because with droughts, if you look at a community, and I'm sure you would be aware of this because there are huge impacts on livestock as well, that as the temperature goes up, the resilience of communities, if drought, for example, continues for a long period of time, then the resilience of communities can become eroded, partly economically in many other ways as well. And then they're less resilient to the sudden onset hazards like floods or bushfires that can strike. So it's these interactions mean that the scale of the hazards the hazards increase and their impacts increase as well. I want to illustrate this. There's some really fascinating international examples of this, including linked to the Arab Spring and the violence and the overthrow of governments in the Arab Spring, linked to food insecurity, which was linked to some simultaneous weather events that have been associated with climate change. But I wanted to bring this back home to Australia and highlight 3 examples of these cascading impacts just to illustrate this. And I'll start with the bushfire season that we've, the black summer that we've just been through. What we saw there was that an unprecedented drought combined with record temperatures that directly contributed to 11 million hectares of destruction across our country, and with enormous cascading impacts like the hazardous air quality that affected Canberra and Sydney and other places as well. The 75% increase as a result of those fires in Australia's emissions of greenhouse gases. At least a $4.5 billion, $5 billion blow. It's much higher now with COVID, blow to the tourism industry, and severe impacts on Australia's biodiversity, as we've seen, just remarkable destruction in World Heritage sites, for example. And of course, the cascading impacts could actually have been a lot worse than they were, because at one point, you may recall, the fires were threatening Warrangamba Dam, which supplies something like 80% of Sydney's water supply. So we were very fortunate to have avoided, as bad as Black Summer was, to avoid much more severe cascading impacts from the unprecedented scale of these crises, of this disaster. So it was an example of scale increasing, the pattern changing, and as a result of that, much bigger cascading impacts on Australian society and on people, livestock, our whole society. If we just look back to, coming back to Wudjil, if we just look back to Queensland summer of 2018-2019, we saw the same pattern as well, really beginning in late 2018, actually. So we had bushfires that were exacerbated by drought and record-setting extreme temperatures, so simultaneous hazards, destroying something like 1 million hectares of bush and farmland, which at the time was the largest expanse of Queensland affected by fire since record keeping began. So back to hundreds of years, actually, because we have some imperfect records, but certainly since any formal records have been kept. So the largest expanse of Queensland affected by fire. But that was followed shortly in the midst of those fires and after some of them by Tropical Cyclone Owen, which set an Australian record of dumping over 680 millimeters of rain in just 24 hours, which is more rain than Melbourne usually receives in a year. But that rainfall wasn't enough to diminish the drought that was gripping much of the state. But a few weeks later, this monsoonal trough I mentioned settled over northern Queensland and released record-setting rains. Over 7,000 square miles of northwest Queensland was flooded. And as a consequence, I'm sure you remember the hundreds of thousands of drought-stressed, freezing cattle that died during that emergency. And so it's another example of simultaneous hazard striking, record-setting events that then, as a result of the scale, the timing, the pattern, the intensity, result in big cascading impacts on society. And the last one I want to highlight is Tasmania's summer of 2015-2016. You notice these are all almost consecutive annual events now. But as we saw in that summer, multiple climate events, including the driest season and warmest summer on record, and an intense marine heat wave. You can see on this chart that reflected in the red blotch, almost larger than Tasmania itself. So you had this intense marine heat wave that struck at the time, which disrupted, well, it contributed to severe bushfires. It disrupted agriculture. It disrupted hydropower generation, and the hot spot in the ocean actually also had major impact on the outbreak of disease in the farmed shellfish industry. So if you combine these climate events and their cascading impacts, the overall impact reduced Tasmania's what was then anticipated gross state product by almost 50%. So these are just 3 examples. Now, not everything I've described in those events would scientists say was caused by climate change. I want to be very clear about this because there is a lot of loose use of IPCC studies and assumptions. For example, people talk about cyclones increasing, that we'll see more cyclones, and in fact the science doesn't say that. It's very uncertain, although there does seem to be consensus that the intensity of cyclones may increase, and Mark may have mentioned this as well, I'm not sure. But still, there are many things like the extreme temperature, the extreme drought that certainly CSIRO and others have very clearly linked to climate change. And what we are seeing are absolutely the things the science says we will increasingly see in the years ahead. Okay, let me talk about how we deal with this crisis. Of course, the single most urgent issue is to reduce greenhouse gases, because if greenhouse gases keep going up, then if they go to 3 degrees of warming, which is currently what they're on track for, really what we're trying to do to adapt to climate change, we will be overtaken by the scale of the hazards that climate change is amplifying. We're just beginning to see these effects now with the Black Summer and the events I described earlier, and other countries we're at the beginning of these large-scale, multiple hazards interacting and causing cascading impacts in society. But so 3 degrees of warming would be absolutely catastrophic. And 2 degrees, as you saw from those figures from the IPCC, itself would be severe. So the single most urgent risk reduction, resilience building measure is to reduce greenhouse gases globally as rapidly as possible. But we also now need to adapt to climate change because we're committed almost certainly to at least 1.5 degrees of warming. And it would be an unprecedented victory to limit warming to 2 degrees of warming, to 2 degrees, given the socioeconomic changes required to do that. But we need to do what we can to limit it to 2 degrees. But even that would, of course, would be serious. But there are some great examples of both low-tech and high-tech solutions to adapt to climate change. And this first dot point, regional impacts, I just want to highlight that what's happening in Australia will be happening in our immediate region as well. And that doesn't only mean disasters in the Pacific or Pacific Island neighbors disappearing under the waves, but it also means huge impacts into our immediate north in places like Indonesia, one of the most populous countries in the world, one of the largest Islamic countries in the world, a country that has some instability and separatist movements. So does the Philippines. And the impacts on food security, which if you'd like during the questions or discussion, I'd be happy to describe some of those, will be enormous. And they will, as we saw in the Arab Spring, create risk and instability in our immediate region, which will require responses from Australia as well. So I just wanted to highlight that because it doesn't actually fit under this caption, but I thought I'd just mention it because it's really critical. So some examples of low-tech solutions that I've seen, and in my job as the Secretary General's Special Representative, I had a chance to visit many countries around the world. In fact, I think I was living on a jet, with probably contributing at least 5% to global warming just from my travel, which I felt guilty about all the time. But anyway, I saw some really innovative, simple solutions, like in Vietnam, in the Mekong Delta, the communities building mounds so that when the flooding happens, they could evacuate their livestock to the mounds, and actually people as well. And I've seen the mounds, very simple, low-tech solution to a problem. Or shifting from chickens to ducks because ducks float. Simple solution, maybe, and that has worked very well to as a simple solution to a problem. In Thailand, the former king had a program called Monkey's Cheeks, which did not involve monkeys, other than as a metaphor, I guess, because essentially it was about building dams. The monkeys can store a lot of food in their cheeks, and the idea is that the villages build big dams so that when the floods happen, the water's captured instead of just draining away. The ponds are then used for drinking water, for fish farming, and other things as a way of dealing with the drought. So it's both a flood control measure and a drought prevention measure, or a drought response measure. And there are so many examples like this of very simple things communities can do to build their resilience to these hazards that are increasing as a result of climate change. A higher tech example, there's a fellow named Han Si, who's one of the wealthiest people in Asia. He's actually Filipino, although his family I think was Chinese. And he owns malls all across Southeast Asia and in China as well. And he was one of our disaster risk champions when I was in the UN. And he took me around in his helicopter to show us examples of what he was doing to build the Philippines' resilience to disasters. And there's one mall actually in Manila, which is designed to flood. The car park floods, the supports underground are round so the debris doesn't stick, it just rolls off as the floods happen. And there are pumps in place to drain the underground parking. And so, of course, it's a good business decision because the community evacuates to the mall and has to shop. But in the meantime, it's also built resilience to flooding. Really remarkable. Now, I mentioned that I've been working with QRA. We are in the unprecedented situation currently that over half of Queensland's local councils have, in the past 3 years, experienced 3 or more disasters requiring disaster relief from state and federal governments. That's never happened before. In essence, they are now in a perpetual state of recovering from disasters. And what that means is that their resilience is slowly eroding. And to think that and one of the reasons I was really keen to be working with QRA is because it's a bit of as the most hazard-prone state in Australia, it's a bit of a preview of what we can expect throughout Australia. And that's a really striking figure, over half of them in more disasters in 3 years. We have very good national level frameworks for building resilience. We have the National Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. We have the disaster risk funding arrangements. We have state resilience strategies. These documents, so DRFA, for example, has money that is available to communities to not just to recover from disasters, but to build back better, and also to invest in other activities that increase resilience, whether it's flood control or low-tech, high-tech, all sorts of things. So there are some pots of money. The gold standard, though, for building resilience is to incorporate climate risk and disaster risk in planning and social and economic investments at every level of society. And what you need to do that, you first need to understand how climate is changing the hazards like bushfire and floods and cyclones. Most of in Hurricane Harvey that struck the southern United States, which just dumped massive amounts of rain on that part of the country, most of the flooding was outside of the 1 in 100 year flood zones that had been identified. And that's because the scale is changing and the pattern is changing as well. So the first priority is, how are these hazards going to affect us at this local level? And then the second is to draw on that, and in planning investments in where we build things, in how we support emergency response, and in essentially basically taking that risk into account in our planning. And it's happening now in those, you know, half of the local councils in Queensland, because disasters have become a core business for them. But for most places, it's not a core challenge to prepare for these disasters and build resilience, although it will increasingly become so. The reality is we have very small pots of money like the DRFA that I mentioned, that is there to help build resilience. The response is, we're going to set up these dedicated pots of money to build resilience. And that's what the government has done so far. When the correct response would be to say, let's look at all of our investments. Let's look at how we can build resilience, or at least create opportunities to do that within all of our investments, given that if you look at infrastructure, you're making investments that will be in place for 40 years potentially. So they really need to take climate risk into account. And just to highlight a couple of brief points, let me just check my time. I'm almost out of time, but I'll wrap up fairly quickly. You know, it's been very interesting to work with local communities about this. So there's a place in Queensland that's a wharf that's a gateway to the Whitsunday Islands. And they've done an amazing job in reconstruction after Cyclone Debbie in lifting the wharf in the reconstruction to take account of sea level rise. And when I asked, how did you decide how high to raise it? They mentioned the IPCC report. When I pointed out that that same report says that by the point at which sea level has risen that high, actually within 15 years, all of the world's the tropical and subtropical coral reefs will be dead, according to this, as a result of the warming oceans and acidification. And I asked, so are you actually also looking at alternative income opportunities and how to transition to different forms of tourism? That was too difficult. That's too difficult a question. And also, of course, they're worried about sending the message to people outside that Australia's coral reef is no longer going to support tourism or be interesting to tourists. So this is just an example of human nature, that some things are too difficult. The easy things we're able to do, the harder things are harder by definition. Also, if you ask communities, what is resilience? How you answer that question depends on where you sit. In some communities where the survival of the community is at risk because industry is closing and leaving, so their highest priority to build resilience is to get some economic activity into their community. In other communities, maybe there's one individual, one person who has enormous skills in a particular area, and that person's retiring and moving away, or the police, the head of the police is moving away, and the loss of even an individual is a crisis for a small community, a small rural community. So in other places, maybe the priority is, yes, we have to build a seawall because we want to deal with extreme weather and sea level rise and the like. So just to highlight this issue of what's resilient, what are the priorities for resilience, very much depend on where you sit. And I just also wanted to highlight that, you know, you have Queensland, those local councils that have now had disasters every year for 3 years. For them, this is the top priority for them, disasters and climate change. But that same dynamic operates at the level of countries. For Bangladesh, climate and disaster risk is being incorporated directly in their economic planning at every level, because they're being struck every year. They're seeing the sea level rise and the cyclones. But in other countries, that's not a priority. It is becoming so in Australia, as we saw with Scott Morrison's announcements after Black Summer including the Royal Commission that will be delivering its recommendations in about sometime next month. But the more we see disasters, the more the pace and the scale, particularly national scale, these disaster impacts are, the more we'll start seeing this treated as core economic priorities in government and in our investments and so on. Now, why, just to conclude, why am I optimistic? The first reason I'm optimistic is that in spite of the political rhetoric, there's actually a lot of bipartisan support among certainly the Labour and the coalition for building Australia's resilience. A number of funds that have been approved, significant amounts of money, the Future Drought Fund, the Emergency Response Fund, those were passed with strong bilateral support. Now, the difference between the rhetoric around that is the government focuses on you know, this is important because we've always had droughts and we need to build our resilience to droughts, whereas Labour would say, this is exactly what we've been warning you about with climate change. But, you know, in a sense, it doesn't really matter, except that you have to appreciate that it's getting worse. Both sides have to appreciate that, and they are seeing that. And I've worked with ministers on both sides on this issue, and they have very similar views about this. So there's strong bilateral support to invest in resilience, and we'll see what happens as the government responds to the Royal Commission recommendations. But I expect there will be strong support for many of those recommendations. And second is that climate mitigation, reducing greenhouse gases, is also accelerating. I'm not sure how much that's happening because of government, certainly in Australia or elsewhere, rather than that it's just becoming economically, renewables are becoming so competitive. And they're already competitive with new coal production in many, many places. They're competitive actually even relative to continuing existing coal facilities to build new renewables. And their competitiveness is going to increase. Saw some studies that were saying the price of renewables with solar is going to half again, cut in half, reduced by half again within about 5 years. So whether or not governments do anything, I mean, they need to, because governments still can accelerate this transition. This transition is happening, and it's going to happen, and it's going to be just remarkable and unprecedented. The second reason is the financial sector is beginning to price both the physical risk, which is the risk that your assets are exposed to disasters, and the transitional risk, which is the risk that you're stuck with, you know, coal mines that are no longer economically viable. And without going into detail, but if you want some information about that, I'm happy to discuss it. That is going to result in literally billions and billions of dollars moving away from coal and moving away from assets that are vulnerable or towards resilience, basically. And then finally, public opinion is really becoming more and more clear, more and more supportive of climate action. And just to end with this point I made earlier, that, you know, the Black Summer bushfires, something like affected directly 60% of Australians. And as these, one thing is certain, is that the frequency and severity of these disasters are going to increase in the years ahead, non-linearly. And the more often we have these, the more commitment there will be in government and more demand from the public for the government to improve our resilience, and also to do whatever it can internationally to support reducing greenhouse gases as rapidly as possible. And I think the real challenge is to try and accelerate that transition, to not have to wait for the disasters to become so overwhelming that we're pushing for that, and in time to prevent the climate from warming from 1.5 to 2 to 3 degrees. Thanks very much.